There's a photograph taken on the afternoon of August 30th, 1945, on the balcony above the noon gate of the imperial city of Huy. A man of 31 stands at the parapet in a yellow brocade robe and a gold turban, the color yellow reserved by law for one family for 143 years. Below him, in the courtyard and spilling into the street, stands a crowd, contemporaries estimated in the tens of thousands. In his hands are two objects. The first is a solid gold seal cast in 1823, weighing 10.78 kilograms, which is roughly 23.5 pounds, about the weight of a car battery. The second is a ceremonial sword with a gold hilt. He hands them to three men in ordinary clothes standing beside him: Tran Huy Liu, Nguyen Luong Bang, and the poet Tzu Hui Khan, delegates of a provisional government that had existed for 11 days. Then the yellow imperial flag came down the pole, and the red flag with the gold star went up. Every man in that photograph outlived the empire. Tran Huy Liu became the founding head of Vietnam's official Institute of History and died in 1969. Tzu Hui Khan became a cabinet minister and one of the country's most celebrated poets, and died in 2005 at the age of 86. The man in the yellow robe died on July 31st, 1997, in a French military hospital in Paris, in a city where almost nobody on the street knew who he was. The dynasty was 143 years old that afternoon. It took less than an hour to end it. What followed is the part almost nobody tells. His wife, the last empress, died alone in a farmhouse in a French village of a few hundred people in 1963, and was buried in the local churchyard. His eldest son, raised from birth to be an emperor, spent 10 years in the French Foreign Legion and the rest of his working life behind a desk in a Paris bank. Another emperor of the same family lay in a grave in Central Africa for 42 years before anyone brought him home. And the gold seal in that photograph vanished into a European bank vault for most of a century and surfaced in a Paris auction catalog in 2022. Almost nobody knows this part of the story. What follows is the full account of what happened to the Nguyen family after the last emperor of Vietnam walked down from that gate, and the details are stranger and more brutal than most people expect. This is not a story about a family that was executed. That would be simpler. This is a story about a family that was allowed to live and then spent 80 years discovering exactly what that permission was worth. They were not shot in a cellar. They were not hanged in a public square. They were handed passports, given deadlines, moved to islands, and slowly turned into ordinary people in countries that had never heard of them. The central question is this: when a dynasty is not killed but simply dissolved, what actually happens to the human beings inside it, and what is left of them 3 generations later? If you find stories like this one worth telling, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. To understand what happened to them afterward, you first have to understand how it all came apart, because the collapse did not begin in 1945. It began nearly a century earlier, and by the time the last emperor stood on that balcony, there was very little left to surrender. The dynasty was founded in 1802 by a prince named Nguyen Phuc An, who took the reign name in Gia Long. He had survived the near extermination of his family during the Tay Son rebellion of the 1770s and 1780s, escaping as a teenager, and he spent 25 years fighting his way back. When he won, he did something no Vietnamese ruler had managed before. He unified the territory from the Chinese frontier in the north to the Kamau Peninsula in the far south, a span of roughly 1,000 miles, and he built a new capital at Huas in the middle with a citadel modeled on European fortress design. His successor, Minh Mang, who ruled from 1820 to 1841, renamed the country Dai Nam, meaning the Great South, extended influence over parts of Cambodia and Laos, and governed an estimated 7 to 10 million people through a Confucian civil service examination system borrowed from China. Those population figures are estimates, and historians dispute them, but the order of magnitude holds. That was the high water mark. Everything after it is subtraction. The subtraction began on September 1st, 1858, when a combined French and Spanish force of roughly 3,000 men and 14 ships attacked the port of Da Nang, then known to Europeans as Touraine. The pretext was the persecution of Catholic missionaries. The actual goal was a foothold. The court in Hue, under Emperor Tu Duc, who reigned from 1847 to 1883, had almost no navy capable of answering, and within a year the French had taken Saigon instead. The first amputation came on June 5th, 1862, with the Treaty of Saigon. Tu Duc's government ceded 3 eastern provinces of the southern delta outright, opened 3 ports, granted freedom of movement to missionaries, and agreed to an indemnity of 4 million silver piastres. The man who negotiated and signed it was a senior mandarin named Phan Thanh Gian, a scholar of enormous reputation who spent the rest of his life being blamed for it. In 1863, he led an embassy to Paris to try to buy the provinces back. He failed. In June 1867, the French seized the 3 remaining western provinces as well, and Phan Thanh Nguyen, who was governing them, surrendered the citadels without a fight rather than see his people massacred. Then he refused food for 17 days, and when that did not kill him quickly enough, he took poison. He died on August 4th, 1867. The court posthumously stripped him of his titles and had his name chiseled off the stone stele that recorded his examination success. Consider what that actually meant. The single most respected official in the empire concluded that the only honorable response to the situation was to stop eating, and his own government erased him for it. There were people who saw exactly what was coming and said so. The most persistent was a Catholic scholar named Nguyen Trong To, who had traveled to Hong Kong, Singapore, Rome, and Paris, and who between 1863 and 1871 submitted a stream of memorials to the throne, around 58 documents by the usual count, begging the court to do what Japan was doing at the same moment. He wanted modern schools, technical training abroad, a reformed tax base, mining, a navy, diplomatic missions, and an end to the exclusive study of classical Chinese texts as a qualification for governing. He argued that the country could not fight a steam-powered enemy with a bureaucracy trained in poetry. He died in 1871, at the age of about 41, with essentially none of it implemented. Others made the same case, Dang Hui Tru, Bui Vien, Nguyen Lo Trach, and got the same result. The reformers were ignored. Compare this to Japan, where the Meiji Restoration began in 1868, 10 years after the attack on Da Nang. Within 37 years, Japan had defeated Russia. Within that same 37 years, Vietnam had ceased to exist as an independent state. That is the entire difference, and it is worth sitting with. The final legal destruction came in two documents. On August 25th, 1883, 6 weeks after Tu Duc died, the Harman Treaty made the north and center a French protectorate. On June 6, 1884, the Paternoster Treaty confirmed it, and in a piece of theater the French insisted on, the silver seal that the Chinese emperor had presented to the Vietnamese court as a token of its status was publicly melted down in the presence of officials. The metal was worth very little. The point was the melting. And this is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because what happened inside the palace over the next 2 years is almost without parallel. Tu Duc died on July 19, 1883, and left no biological children. He had contracted smallpox as a young man and was sterile, so he had adopted 3 nephews. What followed is remembered in Vietnamese history as the period of 4 emperors in 1 year. Duc Duc reigned for 3 days before the regents deposed him. He was imprisoned and died of starvation in his cell in 1883. Hiep Hoa reigned 4 months before being forced to drink poison in November 1883. Kien Phuc, a boy, reigned about 8 months and died in July 1884 at the age of 15 under circumstances that remain disputed to this day. In 18 months, 3 emperors died violently or suspiciously, all of them arranged by the 2 regents who actually ran the country, Ton That Tuyet and Nguyen Van Tuong. The micro-detail that survives from that period is small and awful. The palace records note that Duc Duc, sealed in the Thua Tien prison, was given progressively less rice and water, and that guards were instructed not to speak to him. Then came the boy who mattered. On July 5, 1885, Ton That Tuyet launched a surprise night attack on the French garrison in Hue with roughly 20,000 men against perhaps 1,400 French troops under General de Courcy. It failed by dawn. The French counterattacked, entered the citadel, and looted it. The value taken in gold, silver, and treasure has been reported at figures around 24 million francs, though the accounting is contested. Somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 Vietnamese died. To this day, on the 23rd day of the 5th lunar month, families in Hue set out offerings on the street for the dead of that night. Ton That Tuyet fled into the mountains with the 13-year-old Emperor Ham Nhi. On July 13, 1885, in that emperor's name, they issued the Can Vuong Edict. The words mean aid the king, calling on every scholar and village in the country to rise. Tens of thousands did. It was the largest anti-colonial movement Vietnam had yet produced, and it was crushed piece by piece over the following decade. Ton That Tuyet escaped to southern China and died in exile in Longzhou, in Guangxi province, in 1913, never having returned. Nguyen Van Tuong was arrested and deported to Tahiti, where he died in 1886. Every emperor after that was chosen by France, paid by France, and removable by France. Dong Khan, installed in 1885, died in 1889 at 25. Tan Tai was installed at 10 and deposed in 1907. His son Dui Tan was installed at 7 and deposed in 1916. Khai Dinh, who reigned from 1916 to 1925, was so thoroughly a French creation that when he visited Paris in 1922, a young Vietnamese living in France wrote a satirical play mocking him. That young man's later name was Ho Chi Minh, and the movement he founded in 1930 is the one that would end the dynasty. By 1925, the Emperor of Vietnam had no army, no treasury he controlled, no foreign policy, and no power to appoint his own ministers. By then, nothing was left to save. The final year began not with the Viet Minh, but with the Japanese. On March 9, 1945, Japanese forces, who had occupied Indochina since 1940 while leaving the French colonial administration nominally in place, staged a coup and swept the French out overnight. 2 days later, on March 11th, Emperor Bao Dai, born Nguyen Phuc Vinh Thuy on October 22, 1913, crowned at 12, educated at the Lycée Condorcet in Paris, on the throne since 1926, declared the Protectorate treaties void and proclaimed the Empire of Vietnam. He appointed a scholar named Tran Trong Kim as prime minister. For roughly 5 months, for the first time in 60 years, a Vietnamese emperor issued orders that were not first cleared with a French official. It was an empire with no army, no functioning treasury, and a famine that killed an estimated 1 to 2 million people in the north that same year. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The Viet Minh moved immediately. Hanoi fell to them on August 19th. On August 23rd, an enormous crowd assembled in Hue itself. Bao Dai was inside the Quien Trung Palace, a strange hybrid building of Italian Renaissance detail and yellow-glazed Vietnamese roof tiles that his father had built and that he had modernized in 1932 with Western plumbing and electric light. It was where his father had died on November 6, 1925. It was where his eldest son had been born. On August 22nd, a telegram arrived from the Viet Minh's Provisional Committee demanding that he transfer power. He had a small palace guard. He had the option of asking the Japanese, who were still armed and still in the city, to protect him. He also had a report that a crowd of tens of thousands was moving toward the citadel. He chose to go. On August 25, 1945, he signed the Abdication Edict. Its most famous line has been translated many ways, but the sense is consistent in every version. He would rather be the citizen of a free country than the ruler of an enslaved one. Whether he composed it himself or whether Tran Trong Kim's ministers drafted it is disputed by historians. The public ceremony was held 5 days later on the afternoon of August 30th, 1945 at the Noon Gate. It was the tail end of the summer monsoon season in central Vietnam, humid, the sky heavy. He wore the full imperial regalia one last time, which he had not done for ordinary business in years. The delegation had traveled down from Hanoi. Tran Huy Le read the acceptance. Bao Dai handed over the golden seal and the sword, and the delegates handed him, in exchange, a small red badge with a gold star, the ordinary insignia of the new state. Here is the micro-detail that stays with you. Witnesses described the seal as so heavy that the man receiving it had to adjust his grip. Then the imperial flag came down. The dynasty founded in 1802 ended on August 30th, 1945, after 143 years and 13 emperors. Let that sink in. There was no execution, no trial, no exile order, no shooting. There was a stone balcony, a crowd, a handover, and a change of flags. On September 2nd, 1945, in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh declared independence, quoting the American Declaration of Independence in his opening lines, and the former emperor stood in the crowd as a private person. He was given the title Supreme Advisor to the government and the ordinary citizen's name Vinh Thuy. He was given an office. He was given no work. In March 1946, he was sent to China with a delegation and simply did not come back, drifting to Hong Kong, where he lived for 3 years on money from supporters, borrowed apartments, and card games. Then came the part that would poison his reputation permanently. In 1949, the French, losing a war and needing a Vietnamese face for a non-communist state, brought him back under the Élysée Accords of March 8, 1949, as Chief of State, not Emperor, Chief of State, of the state of Vietnam. He spent much of the next 6 years at Dalat and Nha Trang, rather than in Saigon. In 1954, while attending the Geneva conference that would split the country at the 17th parallel, he bought a Rolex wristwatch in a Geneva shop. Remember that watch. On October 23, 1955, his own prime minister, Ngo Dinh Diem, held a referendum asking voters to choose between them. The announced result was 98.2% for Diem. In Saigon, the official count recorded roughly 605,000 votes from about 450,000 registered voters. The fraud was not even concealed. It took less than an hour to end the dynasty, but it took 10 more years to end the man. What happened after 1955 was not violence, it was paperwork, and paperwork is what actually destroyed them. Under the Republic of Vietnam, declared by Diem on October 26, 1955, the imperial institution was abolished outright. The domain of the crown, the highland territories that had been reserved as the emperor's personal domain since 1950, covering the Central Highlands and parts of the Northwest, was dissolved and absorbed into the state. Every palace, every hunting lodge, every villa at Dalat, every rice estate held in the imperial name in the south became government property. Bao Dai's assets inside Vietnam were seized. He was outside the country and could not contest it in any court that would hear him. In the north, and after 1975, in the entire country, the process was more systematic. Land reform campaigns in the north, from 1953 to 1956, targeted landlords as a class, and the extended imperial clan, the Nguyen Phuoc's lineage, which by the 20th century numbered in the thousands across central Vietnam, was landowning by definition. Family shrines were repurposed. The royal tombs outside Hue, which had been maintained by dedicated villages of hereditary caretakers for over a century, lost their funding and their staff. Grass grew over the courtyards. Buffalo grazed inside the tomb enclosures of Minh Mang and Tuduk. Descendants who had once been supported by court stipends became farmers, cyclo-drivers, and school teachers, and many of them stopped mentioning the family name in public at all. Then came the physical destruction. During the Tet Offensive of 1968, Hue became the site of one of the longest and worst urban battles of the American War. For 26 days, the citadel was fought over street by street. American and South Vietnamese forces shelled and bombed the imperial city to dislodge entrenched North Vietnamese troops. By common accounting, of roughly 160 structures inside the imperial enclosure, about 10 survived intact. The Forbidden Purple City, the private residence of the emperors, was essentially annihilated. Kien Trung Palace, where the last two emperors had lived, had already been destroyed in 1947 during the First War. Only its balustrades and foundation remained. To put this in perspective, imagine waking up one morning and being told that your family home no longer belongs to you, that the cemetery where 11 generations of your family are buried is now public land, that the language of respect people use toward your family is now evidence of political backwardness, that your name on an application form is a liability rather than an asset, and that the passport you hold was issued by a country that has just stopped existing. Then imagine that nobody has done anything illegal to you. Every step was a signed document. For the family members abroad, the documents were the whole problem. The state of Vietnam issued passports until 1955. Then that state was gone. The Republic of Vietnam existed until April 30th, 1975. Then that state was gone too. Family members living in France on Vietnamese travel documents found that renewal was impossible because there was no consulate of the country that had issued them. Most took French nationality, which the French government made available to them relatively easily, and which quietly completed the transformation. The imperial family of Vietnam became French citizens by administrative default. There was no country to return to. They scattered, and the scattering is the part of this story that actually hurts. Start with the emperor who never made it to 1945 at all. Ham Nhi, the boy who fled Hue in 1885, was hunted for 3 years in the mountains of Quang Binh. On November 1st, 1888, he was betrayed for a reward by one of his own guards, a man named Truong Quang Ngoc, and taken while he slept. He was 17. The French shipped him to Algiers, where he arrived on January 13th, 1889, and put him in a villa in the hillside suburb of El Biar. He never saw Vietnam again. He learned French, took up painting seriously enough to exhibit in Paris, married a French woman named Marcel Laloy in 1904, and died in Algiers on January 14th, 1944. 55 years in exile, longer than most people's entire working lives. His body was later moved to a cemetery at Tonac, in the Dordogne region of France. His children became French professionals. His daughter, Princess Nhu Mai, born in 1905, graduated from France's National Institute of Agronomy in 1928, reportedly at the top of her class, and spent her career as an agricultural engineer working with farmers in rural France. She never married and never visited Vietnam. She died in 1999, aged 94. Her sister Nhu Ly, born in 1908, married a French count and lived at a country property in Chabrignac in Correze, and died in 2005. Their brother Minh Duc, born in 1910, served in the French army and died in 1990. Consider what that actually meant. The granddaughter of an emperor of Dai Nam spent her working life advising French dairy farmers on crop rotation, and did it well, and was proud of it. Now the two emperors sent to reunion. Van Tai was deposed in 1907 on the grounds of insanity, a diagnosis most historians consider a political convenience, and confined at Vung Tau. His son, Duy Tan, put on the throne at 7, grew up into exactly what the French had feared. In May 1916, he slipped out of the palace at night and joined a rising organized by 2 scholars, Tran Cao Van and Tai Phien. It was betrayed before it started. Tran Cao Van and Tai Phien were beheaded on May 17, 1916. Duy Tan was deposed, and on November 3, 1916, father and son were both shipped to the island of Reunion in the Indian Ocean, roughly 6,000 miles from Hue. They lived there for decades on a small French allowance. Duy Tan repaired radios for a living. He learned electronics well enough that in 1942 he joined the Free French Forces as a radio operator and rose to the rank of major. He fought for France against Germany, and there is credible evidence that Charles de Gaulle considered installing him back in Vietnam after the war as an alternative to the untested Bao Dai. And then the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. On December 26, 1945, 4 months after the abdication in Hue, while the plan was still being discussed, Duy Tan's aircraft crashed near Mbeki in what is now the Central African Republic. He was 45. He was buried where he fell in Central Africa in a colonial cemetery. His remains were not brought back to Vietnam until April 6, 1987, 42 years later, when they were finally interred at An Lang, the tomb complex outside Hue. His father, Ton Thai, was allowed to return to Vietnam in 1947 after 31 years away. He was 78 when he died in Saigon on March 20th, 1954. The same spring, the French were being surrounded at Dien Bien Phu. And this is where the story becomes truly heartbreaking, because it involves the woman who had the least to do with any of it. Empress Nam Phuong, born Nguyen Hu Thi Lan in 1914, into a wealthy Catholic family in the south, educated in France, married Bao Dai in 1934, and was the only Vietnamese empress ever to be a formal consort with that title rather than one wife among many. She left Vietnam in 1947 and settled eventually in Chabrignac, in Correze, at a farm property near where her husband's relative, Nhu Ly, lived. She had 5 children. Her husband did not live with her. He was in Cannes, in Hong Kong, in Saigon, and Paris, with other companions and a well-documented appetite for casinos. On September 16, 1963, she developed a throat infection. The nearest doctor was in a town some distance away. She died before he arrived. She was 49. 2 of her children were in Paris. The others were abroad. She was buried in the village cemetery of Chabrignac, population a few hundred, under a stone that identifies her as the Empress of Annam. 9 weeks later, Americans were watching the news from Dallas, and no newspaper outside France noted that the last Empress of Vietnam had died alone in a farmhouse. Here's the betrayal. Bao Dai did not attend her funeral. The reasons given vary by source, and the family has never fully explained it, but the fact is not disputed. Here is the small decency, and it is real. The people of Chabrignac, who had known her as the quiet foreign lady at the manor, tended her grave for decades. They still do. Visitors from Vietnam who make the trip to that cemetery today report finding it clean and marked and cared for by villagers who never met her. The children lived out the strangest version of all. Crown Prince Bao Long, born January 4, 1936 in Kien Trung Palace, had been trained from infancy for a throne. He joined the French Foreign Legion, served 10 years, fought in the Algerian War, then came back to Paris and worked in a bank for the rest of his career. He married a French woman, Thérèse Delanne, had no children, and gave almost no interviews in 71 years. He and his father sued each other in French court over the imperial regalia. The court eventually ruled that the seal belonged to Bao Dai and the sword to Bao Long. Bao Long is reported to have sold the abdication sword. He died on July 28, 2007, aged 71, in Sens, France, and was buried at Chabrignac beside his mother. His brother Bao Thong, born September 30, 1944, in Dalat, also had no children, and died in Paris on March 15, 2017, aged 72. Their sister Phuong Mai, born in 1937, married an Italian nobleman and died in 2021. Princess Phuong Nguyen, born in 1938, married a French banker. They all believed at first that this was temporary. Through the late 1940s, there were serious negotiations. In 1949, Bao Dai actually did go back as head of state. Through the 1950s, there were monarchist committees, letters, position papers. The belief died on a specific date, October 23, 1955, the day the referendum result was announced. After that, no Nguyen ever held office in Vietnam again. Nobody was coming for them. The last emperor himself spent his final decades in a modest apartment in the 16th arrondissement of Paris, on a short street near the river. He had a small French state pension arrangement and support from friends. He wrote a memoir published in 1980. In 1972, he married Monique Baudot, a French woman born in 1946, 33 years younger than he was, who used the style Princess Vang Thuy and later claimed the title of Empress. She died in Paris on September 27, 2021, aged 75. In 1988, he was baptized a Roman Catholic under the name Jean Robert. He died on July 31, 1997, at the Val-de-Grâce Military Hospital in Paris, aged 83, and was buried at Passy Cemetery. His death got a paragraph in most papers. 5 weeks later, Princess Diana died in the same city, and the world stopped. The contrast is the whole story of this dynasty in 1 month of 1997. The living family today is small, elderly, and almost entirely French and American. The headship is genuinely disputed, and anyone who tells you otherwise is picking a side. The legitimate male line of Bao Dai and Nam Phuong ended on March 15, 2017, with the death of Bao Thong, because neither he nor his brother had sons. By the reckoning followed by the Nguyen Phuoc Clan Council and most reference works, the position of head of the house then passed to Guy Georges Vinh San, also known by the family name Nguyen Phuoc Bao Ngoc, born January 31, 1933, in Saint-Denis, Réunion, the son of the Emperor Duitan, born in exile on the island where his father repaired radios. He is 93 years old, has lived his entire life in France and Réunion, worked an ordinary civilian career, and has 1 son and 3 daughters with French first names. He first visited Hue in 2016 to attend the memorial rites for his grandfather Than Thai, and photographs from that visit show a man in his 80s wearing a traditional robe for the first time in his life. The competing claim belongs to Nguyen Phuc Bao An, born in Dalat on November 3rd in either 1951 or 1952, depending on the source, the son of Bao Dai and a concubine named Le Thi Phi An. He attended a military academy in Dalat, remained in Vietnam after 1975, emigrated to the United States in 1992, and lives in Westminster, California, in the heart of the largest Vietnamese community outside Vietnam. His mother died in Vietnam in 1986. Some Vietnamese language sources describe him as the head of the house, on the grounds that he is Bao Dai's surviving son. He has 2 sons. Think about that for a moment. The most plausible living claimant to the throne of Vietnam has spent 30 years living in a suburb of Orange County, California, roughly 20 minutes from Disneyland. But here is what almost nobody realizes. The country that abolished them has spent the last 30 years buying them back. The reversal started quietly. Hue's imperial complex was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1993, the first site in Vietnam to receive that status. Restoration money followed, then tourism, then a biennial Hue festival built around reenacted court ceremony. In February 2024, after 5 years of work costing about 123 billion dong, roughly $5 million, the state reopened a fully reconstructed Kien Trung Palace, the exact building where Bao Dai received the delegation in 1945, recreated from photographs down to the porcelain mosaic and the yellow glazed roof tiles. On January 1st, 2025, Hue was elevated to the status of a centrally governed city, a rank shared with only a handful of Vietnamese cities, on the explicit basis of its heritage economy. And then there is the seal. In October 2022, the Milan auction house in Paris listed the golden seal Hoang de Chi Bao, the one from the photograph, cast in 1823, 10.78 kilograms of gold, for sale. The Vietnamese government intervened. After more than a year of negotiation and legal maneuvering, the sale was halted, and a Vietnamese businessman, Nguyen the Hong, paid 6.1 million euros for it, with government backing. It was formally handed over at the Vietnamese embassy in Paris on November 16, 2023, and it now sits in a display case with a fingerprint lock at a private museum in Bac Ninh province, in a room that also contains a portrait of Emperor Minh Mang and a statue of Ho Chi Minh. In January 2025, it was officially designated a national treasure by government decision. Meanwhile, in 2017, the Rolex that Bao Dai bought in Geneva in 1954 sold at auction there for $5,060,000, at the time a record for a wristwatch. The former emperor's watch was worth more in a single afternoon than any property his family had held since 1955. The dynasty came home as an object. The present-day consequence still unfolding is a quiet argument about who owns that history. Vietnamese state historiography has moved over 3 decades from treating the Nguyen as feudal collaborators to treating them as the builders of the last unified Vietnamese state, a reframing that matters enormously for current maritime claims, since it is Nguyen-era records from the 1830s that document official expeditions to the Paracel and Spratly Islands. Every restored palace is also a document in a live territorial dispute. At the same time, the descendants themselves have no standing in any of it. Nobody consulted the family about the seal. Set this dynasty against the others, and the difference becomes obvious. The Romanovs were murdered. 11 people, including 4 daughters and a hemophiliac boy, shot and bayoneted in a cellar in Yekaterinburg on July 17, 1918. And precisely because of that, they became martyrs, canonized in 2000, reburied in a cathedral with a president in attendance. The Ottomans were expelled by law on March 3, 1924, 155 people given days to pack. But many carried out portable wealth and married into the royal houses of Egypt, Iraq, and Hyderabad. Turkey let the women return in 1952 and the men in 1974. The Habsburgs lost an empire in 1918 and produced Otto von Habsburg, who sat in the European Parliament for 20 years and died in 2011 at 98, honored. Even Puyi, the last Qing emperor, who was jailed for a decade and finished as a gardener and archivist in Beijing, became a national symbol of transformation and died in 1967 with the state watching. The Nguyen got none of those endings. They were not killed, so there are no martyrs. They were not rich, so there was no cushion. They were not restored, so there is no institution. And crucially, they left. Every other family on that list has a burial ground in its own country. The last empress of Vietnam is buried in a French village. The last emperor is buried in a Paris cemetery. The crown prince is buried beside his mother in Correze. What was taken from them was not their lives and not really their money. It was the ability to be from anywhere. That is the thing worth sitting with. Status is a story other people agree to keep telling about you. When the telling stops, nothing physical changes in the room, and yet everything is gone. A man walked down a stone staircase in Hue in 1945 and was the same man at the bottom as at the top, and the difference between those two men was only that several million people had stopped agreeing on something. Stripped of a throne, stripped of a country, stripped of the language that made them who they were, and what was left was a bank clerk in Paris, an agronomist in the French countryside, a radio operator in the Free French Forces, and a retiree in Southern California. So here is the question. If the descendants have French passports and American driver's licenses and jobs their great-grandfathers could not have imagined, and if the country that removed them now spends millions restoring their palaces and repatriating their gold, who actually won? Is the seal in that glass case a nation reclaiming its history, or a family's last possession finally taken for good? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to the channel.